Death and medicine are two things that have long been associated with this place. Picture endless hospital corridors disappearing into darkness, rusted bed frames sitting beneath collapsing ceilings, entire wards abandoned to mold, silence, and time. Thousands of people once passed through these halls, doctors, nurses, soldiers, patients. Some recovered and returned home, others never left. Long after the hospital itself fell silent, stories continued to emerge from within its walls. Stories of footsteps heard in empty corridors, of military figures standing motionless in abandoned wards, of voices calling out where no one should have been. For years, Changi Hospital developed a reputation unlike almost any other location in Singapore. To some, it was simply a decaying building. To others, it was a place best avoided altogether. This is the untold story of Changi Hospital. To understand how this hospital became surrounded by so many dark legends, we first need to go back to the beginning. The reputation of this structure did not appear overnight. It was built over decades, built from history, built from tragedy, and according to some, built from the people who never truly left. The eastern region of Singapore has long been associated with military activity. During the Second World War, the area around Changi became connected to some of the most difficult chapters in the island's history. Military installations, detention facilities, and wartime compounds transformed the landscape. Thousands of servicemen passed through the region. Many returned home, but countless others did not. In the years that followed the war, Singapore changed rapidly. New facilities were built, old ones were repurposed, and the Changi area continued to serve an important role in military operations. Among the most significant of these facilities was Changi Hospital. For decades, it served military personnel and civilians alike. Doctors worked around the clock, treating illness, injury, and every kind of medical emergency imaginable. Like most hospitals, Changi witnessed moments of extraordinary relief and extraordinary grief. Thousands of patients passed through its wards over the decades. Doctors worked long shifts through the night. Nurses moved constantly between rooms. The building existed to preserve life whenever possible. But no hospital wins every battle. Eventually, the facility ceased operations. Patients were transferred elsewhere, staff moved on, and the equipment disappeared. The wards emptied, and for the first time in decades, a heavy silence settled over the building. Windows shattered, paint peeled from the walls. Vegetation slowly reclaimed the surrounding grounds. What had once been a place filled with constant activity became an abandoned structure overlooking the eastern coastline. But many people would later claim that the building was never entirely empty. As the years passed, Changi Hospital developed a reputation that extended far beyond its broken walls. Stories began circulating among local residents, security personnel, and eventually, urban explorers. Some accounts were relatively minor. People reported hearing footsteps in corridors they knew were empty. Others described doors moving on their own, despite the complete absence of electricity throughout much of the complex. Several visitors claimed they heard distant conversations echoing through vacant wards, only to discover there was nobody else inside the building. Among the most commonly reported experiences was an unusual smell. Visitors frequently described encountering the sharp scent of antiseptic and disinfectant in parts of the hospital that had been abandoned for years. The reports were remarkably consistent. People described the smell as fresh, not stale, not lingering. Fresh, as though the hospital was still operating somewhere just beyond sight. Other reports were much more difficult to explain. Several explorers claimed they saw figures standing at the ends of hallways. Most described them as motionless silhouettes that disappeared the moment they were approached. A smaller number reported seeing individuals dressed in what appeared to be old military uniforms. These figures were often observed in areas associated with the oldest sections of the facility. When approached, they were said to simply vanish. Whether these stories were genuine encounters, misunderstandings, or products of suggestion remains impossible to know. What is certain is that Changi Hospital attracted increasing attention because of them. By the early 2000s, photographs of the hospital were appearing regularly on internet forums dedicated to urban exploration. Images of abandoned wards, broken operating rooms, and overgrown corridors drew thousands of views. The hospital had become something of a challenge, a place that many people wanted to see for themselves. One of those people was a young urban explorer named Marcus Tan. Unlike many visitors, Marcus had little interest in the paranormal. He considered himself practical. He believed most ghost stories could be explained through imagination, environmental conditions, or simple misunderstandings. To Marcus, Changi Hospital was not a haunted location. It was merely an abandoned building with an exaggerated reputation. That belief would eventually lead him to make 3 mistakes. He decided to target Changi Hospital, which was widely considered the holy grail of local hauntings. This was his first mistake. The second occurred deep beneath the eastern wing, and the third mistake was looking directly into the reflection of a shattered glass partition inside the eastern wing. According to Marcus, everything that followed could be traced back to those 3 decisions. It was a Friday afternoon when he arrived at the hospital grounds. Unlike many of the thrill-seekers who visited Changi Hospital after dark, Marcus preferred a different approach. He believed daylight eliminated most of the risks people associated with abandoned buildings. No shadows, no tricks of the eye, no opportunities for fear to distort what was actually there. His plan was simple: enter the hospital during the afternoon, photograph the most well-known areas, and leave long before sunset. The tropical heat was heavy that day. Dark clouds were beginning to gather offshore as Marcus made his way toward the perimeter fence near Halton Road. Even from a distance, the hospital appeared imposing. The white exterior walls had long since surrendered to the tropical climate. Black mold stained large sections of the structure. Vegetation pressed against the lower floors, and broken windows stared out across the surrounding grounds. The building looked abandoned, but it did not look empty. Using a pair of hand tools, Marcus disconnected a rusted section of the chain-link fencing and slipped through the opening. For a moment, he simply stood there. The grounds were completely silent. There were no voices, no nearby traffic, and no sounds coming from the building itself, only the occasional movement of leaves in the surrounding brush. Marcus began walking toward one of the side entrances. The door hung partially open, its hinges long since rusted away. He pushed it aside and stepped into the eastern wing. The transition was immediate. The bright afternoon sunlight disappeared behind him. The temperature remained warm, but the atmosphere changed completely. The first thing Marcus noticed was the smell. It wasn't mold, it wasn't stagnant water, or the typical scent of a building left to rot for years. Instead, the corridor carried the unmistakable smell of disinfectant. It was sharp, clinical, and completely fresh. It was the kind of smell normally associated with an active hospital. Marcus stopped and looked around. The corridor ahead stretched into darkness. Paint peeled from the walls, and dust covered the floor. Many of the doors stood partially open, revealing empty consultation rooms and storage areas stripped long ago of anything valuable. There was no sign that anyone had been inside recently, yet the smell remained strong enough to sting the back of his throat. Years later, Marcus would discover that he was far from the first person to report this. Among the many stories associated with Changi Hospital, reports involving the smell of antiseptic were surprisingly common. Visitors who had never met each other often described the same experience, a functioning hospital hidden inside an abandoned one. At the time, Marcus dismissed it. He assumed some forgotten chemical container had leaked somewhere within the building. The explanation seemed reasonable enough. He raised his camera and took his first photograph. An empty corridor, a row of abandoned doors. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Just another abandoned building, or so he believed. Marcus continued deeper into the eastern wing. The further he moved from the entrance, the quieter the hospital became. At first, he paid little attention to it. Then he began to notice something unusual. The sounds from outside had disappeared. The distant traffic, the wind, the insects, all of it was gone. The silence inside the hospital seemed to swallow everything. Several former visitors would later describe the same sensation. Many said the building possessed an unusual stillness, as though the hospital existed entirely separately from the world around it. Marcus continued photographing corridors and empty rooms. Most of the images were disappointing. Peeling paint, broken furniture, dust-covered floors. There was nothing that justified the stories, and nothing that explained the hospital's reputation. Eventually, he reached the far end of the wing. There he found a stairwell leading downward. Among urban explorers, the lower levels of Changi Hospital had acquired a particularly unsettling reputation. Stories varied depending on who was telling them. Some spoke of abandoned storage areas, while others claimed the lower sections had once been connected to wartime holding rooms and military facilities. Whether those stories were true was difficult to verify, but what remained consistent was the number of terrifying reports originating from below ground. Marcus decided to take a look for himself. The stairs were littered with debris. Fragments of broken glass crunched beneath his shoes as he descended. With each step, the temperature seemed to drop. At first, he assumed it was simply because the lower levels received less sunlight. But by the time he reached the bottom landing, the difference was impossible to ignore. The air felt noticeably freezing cold, a strange sensation in a building that had sat for years beneath the tropical heat of Singapore. Marcus paused at the bottom of the stairs. The corridor ahead was narrow and unfinished. Bare concrete walls stretched into darkness, and the beam from his torch illuminated only a short distance ahead. Beyond that, the passage disappeared into deep shadow. For a few moments, nothing happened. The corridor remained completely still. Marcus raised his camera and took several photographs. The flash briefly illuminated a series of old doors further down the hallway, and then darkness returned. As he lowered the camera, his second mistake occurred. He stayed too long. A sound broke the silence. Metal striking concrete, once, then again. Marcus remained perfectly still, listening. The sound came from somewhere deeper within the lower level. Another step followed, then another. Slow, measured, deliberate. It sounded remarkably similar to somebody walking through the corridor, wearing heavy boots. The footsteps continued, moving in a straight line directly toward him. The sound grew louder, each impact echoing through the narrow concrete passageway. At first, Marcus assumed another explorer had entered the building. The explanation made sense until he remembered something. There were no other footprints in the dust, and he had not seen anyone else enter. The footsteps kept approaching, steady, disciplined, almost rhythmic, as though whoever was producing them had marched the same route countless times before. Marcus waited for the person to emerge from the darkness, but nobody did. The footsteps continued, yet the corridor remained completely empty. Marcus turned and headed back toward the stairwell. The footsteps tracked him for several seconds behind his back, and then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound. Marcus climbed the stairs 2 at a time and emerged back into the eastern wing. The warmer air of the upper floor should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. The hospital felt completely different now. The corridors he had walked through earlier seemed unfamiliar. Intersections appeared identical, doorways blended together. More than once, he found himself stopping to look around, convinced he had already passed through the exact same section. Years later, other explorers would describe a similar experience. Many claimed the hospital had an unusual way of disrupting a person's sense of direction, whether it was the result of the building's repetitive layout or something else entirely. Marcus continued moving. His goal had completely changed. He was no longer searching for photographs. He simply wanted to find the nearest exit. Turning a corner, he entered what appeared to have once been a large medical ward. The room stretched far beyond the reach of his torch, filled with rows of rusted iron bed frames. Many still stood exactly where they had been left years earlier, their mattresses long gone, leaving only the skeletal metal structures. The large windows along the exterior walls had been boarded over from the outside. Thin shafts of daylight slipped through the gaps in the wood, creating narrow bands of light across the dusty floor. The ward was dead silent. Marcus began weaving his way between the rows of beds. Halfway through the room, he heard a loud impact somewhere behind him. He stopped. Another impact followed, then another. A heavy wooden door had slammed shut. Several seconds later, a second door slammed, then a third. The loud impacts echoed violently throughout the ward, one after another, moving around the perimeter of the room as though someone was systematically closing every single entrance to trap him. Marcus turned in place, sweeping his torch beam across the darkness, but he saw nothing. Yet the impacts continued. Door after door, slam, slam, slam. The noise eventually stopped, and the ward fell silent once again. But something else had changed. The smell of antiseptic had returned, stronger than before. What had earlier been a noticeable scent now felt completely overwhelming. The sharp chemical odor filled the entire room, and Marcus covered his mouth instinctively. For a moment, he considered calling out, asking if someone else was inside, but the idea disappeared almost immediately. Every sound he had encountered since entering the hospital seemed designed to suggest another person was nearby, yet he had never actually seen anyone. Then his torch beam struck a reflective surface near the center of the ward. It was an old nurse's station, and part of the structure was enclosed by a large glass partition. The glass was cracked and coated in years of accumulated dust. Under normal circumstances, it would have been almost impossible to see a reflection in it, but from where Marcus stood, the angle was just right. The surface reflected a distorted image of the ward behind him. Marcus glanced toward it, and that was when he made his third mistake. Marcus later said that he only looked at the glass for a single second, but it was enough. At first, he saw only his own reflection, a pale face illuminated by the narrow beam of his torch, the empty ward behind him, and the rows of rusted beds. Then he noticed something that should not have been there. The ward behind him was no longer empty. Reflected in the dusty glass, standing closely between the rows of iron bed frames, were dozens of figures, perhaps more. Marcus never attempted to count them. They stood shoulder to shoulder throughout the ward, perfectly still, perfectly silent. Every one of them appeared to be wearing a military uniform, dark tunics, high collars, and structured caps that looked decades out of place. At first, Marcus believed he was somehow looking at a group of real people who had entered the building without him noticing. Then he focused on their faces, or rather, the total absence of them. Where eyes, noses, and mouths should have been, there was only darkness, not shadows, and not distance. Total darkness, smooth and featureless, as though every face had been removed and replaced by a black void. The figures were not looking around the room, and they were not interacting with one another. Every one of them appeared focused on a single point: Marcus. Years later, he would struggle to describe exactly why the sight disturbed him so deeply. The uniforms were unsettling and the silence was terrifying, but it was the stillness that remained with him. None of the figures moved, not one. They simply stood there among the abandoned beds, watching. Marcus did not turn around. Many people later asked him why, and his answer was always the same. He was afraid that if he turned and saw those same things standing in the actual ward, he would never recover from it. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on the glass reflection. Then, something changed. One of the figures moved. Not much, just a slight tilt of the head. The movement spread through the formation, one after another, dozens of featureless faces turning toward him in perfect, synchronized unison. That was enough. Marcus turned and ran. He moved between the rows of beds as quickly as he could, ignoring the rusted frames that scraped against his clothing. Somewhere behind him, another door slammed, then another. The impacts echoed throughout the ward, but Marcus did not look back. Near the far side of the room, he found a section of broken glass where one of the windows had partially collapsed. Using the heavy base of his camera, he struck the remaining fragments and cleared enough space to climb through. The sharp edges tore at his sleeves and hands as he forced his body outside. He landed heavily among the wet grass and overgrown vegetation. For several moments he remained on the ground trying to catch his breath. Then he got up and ran. He crossed the grounds, passed through the opening in the fence and did not stop moving until the hospital was no longer visible behind him. According to Marcus, he never once looked back at the building, not even once. The journey home should have ended the experience. At least, that is what Marcus expected. The hospital was behind him, the afternoon sun was still high in the sky, and people moved through the streets as they always had. Everything appeared completely normal, yet Marcus could not shake the feeling that something had followed him out of the building. Back at his flat, he locked the door and went directly to his room. The smell of antiseptic remained. Hours later, he would still remember it clearly. No matter where he went in his home, he could still detect the same sharp, clinical scent he had encountered inside the hospital. Marcus attempted to explain away everything he had experienced: the footsteps, the ward, the reflection. He convinced himself that exhaustion, suggestion, and panic had likely distorted his perception. The explanations were not entirely satisfying, but they were preferable to the alternative. Eventually, he sat down on the edge of his bed and tried to calm himself. Then, his mobile phone rang. Marcus immediately looked at the screen. No number appeared, no caller identification, only the words, "Unknown caller." For several moments, he simply stared at it. Then, he answered. At first, he heard nothing, no static, no background noise, and no indication that anyone was actually connected to the call. The silence continued for several seconds. Then, another sound emerged, a page turning slowly, deliberately, as though someone was sitting at a desk, flipping through a large paper ledger. The sound repeated. Another page, then another. Marcus listened in total silence. A few moments later, a voice spoke. It was calm, flat, and entirely clinical. The voice addressed Marcus by his full name. He immediately sat upright on his mattress. Then the voice began reciting numbers one by one, slowly and precisely. It was his official identity card number. Every single digit was correct. The voice spoke without hesitation, without error, and without emotion. When it finished, the line fell silent once more. Several seconds passed, and then Marcus heard a sharp scratching sound right against the speaker, a short, deliberate mark made against paper, like someone aggressively crossing a name off a list. The voice delivered one final word, "Next." Then a long hiss came through the line, and the call died. Marcus remained seated on the edge of his bed, the phone still clutched in his hand. For a long time he simply stared at the floor. Eventually, his attention shifted slowly toward his bedroom window. The late afternoon sunlight reflected faintly from the glass panes, and there, within the reflection of the glass, Marcus noticed something that immediately brought him back to the ward. He was no longer alone. Standing directly around his bed were three figures, motionless, silent, dressed in military uniforms, their faces completely dark. Marcus did not turn around. He never checked to see if anything was actually standing in the room behind him. And unlike many stories associated with Changi Hospital, there was no dramatic ending, no disappearance, no official explanation, and no final confrontation. What Marcus did claim was simple. From that day forward, he never returned to Changi Hospital, and he never again answered a call from an unknown number. Today, much of the original Changi Hospital complex no longer stands. The wards have been demolished, the corridors are gone, and modern redevelopment has completely changed the landscape of the hill. Yet the stories remain. Whether those stories are the product of imagination, folklore, or something far stranger is impossible to say. What is certain is that for decades, thousands of people passed through Changi Hospital, doctors, nurses, soldiers, and patients. Some arrived there on ordinary days and left with ordinary memories, while others never left at all. Perhaps places connected to so much suffering simply leave a lasting mark behind. Or perhaps some memories refuse to disappear, no matter how many concrete walls are torn down. Whatever the truth may be, Changi Hospital remains one of Singapore's most enduring legends. And if Marcus Tan's account is to be believed, the hospital did not need to keep him within its walls in order to follow him home. The story is over. But before you leave, take a moment and listen to your surroundings. If you ever find yourself alone in a quiet room and you suddenly catch the unmistakable smell of antiseptic where there shouldn't be any, pay attention. And if your phone rings immediately afterward from an unknown number, you may want to let it ring. Turn off your lights, lock your doors, and if you happen to glance at your reflection tonight, just make sure you're the only one standing there. I'll see you next week, same day, at 3 a.m. in a new episode.